Hi. So I'm Professor Marek Korczynski, and with Laurie Cohen, I am honored to be editor-in-chief of the wonderful journal Work Employment Society, obviously the name of this conference. And we've got a second wonderful keynote address now. It's Ashok Kumar from Birkbeck University in London. He's written this wonderful book, Monopsony, Capitalism. It won the American Sociological Association 2021 Paul Sweezy Outstanding Prize, the 2022 Emanuel Wallerstein Memorial Book Award, and let me read some further comments. Michael Burrowoy said, exemplary engaged research that challenges the fatalism accompanying neoliberalism. Richard Hyman said, the sweatshop economy is pervasive in today's global capitalism. Ashok Kumar charts its evolution, shows how market power is becoming concentrated, and also charts the rise of worker resistance, which exploits vulnerabilities in the new production systems. And if that's not enough, David Harvey said, a major theoretical and empirical contribution to our understanding of the evolving state of contemporary global industrial capitalism. So we're delighted to have Ashok here today to talk about resistance in the workplace as a crucible of resistance.
Thanks, Marek, for that introduction. Thank you for the invitation to WES, and also this conference has been incredible. I'm especially grateful for the theme of resistance. This title is kind of a kind of placeholder. They asked me ages ago, and I sort of just said this because it was like general enough that it could include anything. But the actual title is probably closer to how workers win, and I think I want to go through a series of kind of case studies, illustrative examples, to try and think about these questions about resistance, the dynamics of capitalism, and how we analyze that. I begin with talking about power at the workplace. People will be familiar with some of these questions, but some people might not be. And then some of my own research on the sort of structural dynamics of global capitalism, how they're changing, how that opens up potential vistas for worker organizing and structural power, and then finally some ideas on our own workplace, much of it informed from last night's discussions. And as a few sort of provocations, I want to sort of firstly insist on the centrality of work and the universality of struggle, sort of to do in our own research. I think also thinking about the question of skill as being largely ideological, and that effective resistance has to analyze the workplace as a fundamental antagonism between the class interests of the proprietors of capital and the class interests of labor. So, for the last, 30, 40 years, there's been a lot of, kind of end of the power of the working class. I'm thinking of Andre Gore's Farewell to the Working Class, or Manuel Castell's work and other people's work, basically trying to say that, the workplace is no longer a space of struggle, at least in a revolutionary sense. But I've just chosen 4 mass struggles, populist struggles of the last 15 years. There's been any number of them, Tunisia, Green Movement in Iran, problems notwithstanding, red shirts in Thailand, and Egypt. And these were all mass struggles. They were struggles that took over squares, they took over the streets, they were popular struggles, but the ones where they were actually able to upend the existing, at least political order, and I guess in Tunisia's case, maybe even the social order, was ones where they could withdraw their labor at a sort of generalized state. So on day 16 and day 18, they call a general strike, and they bring the economy to its knees, and that's the power of the working class. So I think some of this has been, largely talking about the global north, but I'll get to that in a minute. And also I think the purpose of this talk is to talk about workers, but also materialism, universalism. I think since the 1980s, there's been a real echoing of universalisms and meta-narratives. And I think that there's been a focus really on what divides us rather than sort of what unites us. And that's why, when Marx ends the manifesto with, workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. He's not saying that there isn't divisions between us. He's saying, whatever our divisions across time and space, the thing that unites us is that none of us want to be in chains. And so our research, especially on resistance, should, to quote Marx again, not just observe the world, but attempt to change it. So I'm going to use my first case, COVID. So George Lukács in History and Class Consciousness says it's moments of crisis that capitalism reveals itself in its totality. And crisis is a crucial element to not only see it as an inflection point within capitalism, but also reveal capitalism and sort of the internal dynamics within it. So what we saw in COVID is a kind of demystifying of capitalism to its original accumulation. I would say health, of course, but also food. So food supply chain included farm workers, logistics, transportation, warehousing, grocery stores. Workers in these sectors prior to the crisis were deemed as non-essential and expendable, therefore had low bargaining power. During the crisis, they became essential. And I'm reminded of Ian Wood's work, that actually the necessary precondition to capitalism is the mass production of the commodity. The necessary precondition to the mass production of the commodity is a surplus of workers. The necessary condition to produce a surplus of workers is a surplus of food. So food becomes the object of original accumulation. And so that becomes the essential component. That's why she's saying, okay, it starts, obviously channeling Robert Brenner, but she says between 1500 and 1700 in England, it was the most productive agriculture in the history of the world. And that's the necessary precondition for capitalism. And so despite, I remember Alan Sugar in an interview was like, I was sitting for months, I didn't leave my compound. And so it revealed that the most skilled workers in society were not only redundant, but they were parasitic. People were needing to risk their lives to get them food in their compounds and their gated communities. And the most essential workers were the ones that we called unskilled. So skill becomes this kind of ideological object. And so the places where those gains were made were actually in places where workers actually took strike action. There was a kind of, for example, in Britain, clap for carers, clap for this, clap for that. But it was that none of that translated into remuneration. It only translated when workers took strike action. So an essential part of understanding power and structural power is disruptive power, but disruptive potential. Here, the centrality of disruptive power, or the powers of workers to disrupt, is a measure of how much leverage they have at a structural level. No matter what workplace we're talking about, the key measure of workers' power is disruption. And within that, this is Eric Olin Wright's work, of course, and Perrone, but building on that, Beverly Silver posits two kinds of structural power. Marketplace bargaining power, many of you will be familiar with this, and the second is positional power. Here, from 2 days ago, I don't know if you guys have seen this. This man did this quote, it's making the rounds. I'm going to read it to you. We need to see unemployment rise globally. This is Tim Gurner, is a billionaire who's at a conference. We need to see unemployment rise globally. It needs to jump 40, 50%. We need to see pain in the economy. We need to remind people that they work for the employer, not the other way around. There's been a systemic change where employees feel the employer is extremely lucky to have them, as opposed to the other way around. We've got to kill this attitude, and that has to come through hurting the economy. Governments around the world are trying to increase unemployment to get that to some sort of normality. We've started to see less arrogance in the employment market, and that has to continue. Look, I think that I like this. I like capitalists like this. Don't give me that postmodern, no tie, sneaker-wearing horizontal nonsense. Give me this brutal, they're sharpening the contradictions for us. So it's like Tim Gurner comes out and says this, and what does that mean? If you look at people like, if you look at even, for example, interest rates, Andrew Bailey came out, said much of the reason for interest rates, which is exogenous to the economy, is to loosen the labor market. It's very much about disciplining the working class because it's trying to reduce marketplace bargaining power. But this is ideological. Look at, for example, the US Chamber of Commerce. They represent ostensibly businesses in America, and 80% of healthcare in America is given through the employer. It costs the employer money, yet the Chamber of Commerce lobbies against a universal system given by the government. Why? Because it's about not only a question of intensifying, it's not only a question of numbers, like quantifying an increased reserve army of labor. It's about intensifying that reserve army of labor, making it more and more desperate, giving greater bargaining power to the employer. Or even Kathleen's keynote on Tuesday, where she talked about how when there was a tighter labor market, they were like, oh, retire, live your life, elderly people. But then when it was looser, a loose labor market, they're like, no, this is ageism. Get back into the workplace, elderly people. So it's like this is actually measured is one key measure. But the second one is positional power, which is what I kind of focus on in my own work. This is where workers are positioned with the measure of their powers, where they're positioned within production. So you have core functions, peripheral functions, bottlenecks. People are familiar with choke points. So people know that, like, a logistics worker or a dock worker is a critical choke point, has more power. So, like, if you're a worker in a cookie factory in London, you'll have less power than, say, if you're a driver on the tube, because a cookie factory can be replaced, it can relocate, it's not essential to the ongoing functioning of the city. Similar to jobs. So if you're a crane operator at a dock, you'll have much more power at a port, whatever, than if you're a crane operator in, I don't know, some village, and you're moving things at a warehouse. So also, positional bargaining power is where a crucial input in the production process. So a strike at a plant that produces a key input can bring the entire company to its knees. And lastly, the one I focus on is the question of concentration and consolidation as leverage, which we'll get to in a second. So this is a very famous example. People are aware. Was reminded of this because yesterday the UAW just announced they'll be going on strike, which is, I think, a really good sign. This is a famous example. It's where, crucially, function of the production process is able to have outsized power in shutting down production. So 1936, a fledgling union, United Auto Workers, was looking to how they could leverage their limited resources to maximize disruption against a powerful employer, General Motors, which dominated 43% of the American car manufacturing sector. So UAW began secretly organizing at the Fisher Body Plant in Flint. The Fisher Body Plant was where all the bodies for GM production was made. So it wasn't a peripheral, it was a core function. 1936, 7,000 workers flooded into the factory and began their historic sit-down strike. Eventually spread to 17 factories over 44 days, 136,000 workers. It brought all the production to its knees. It raised wages and crucially recognized UAW, but the UAW was recognized as the official union. And then, incidentally, it spread to another 500,000 workers and a wave of strikes after. So this is, there we go. So this is, now I'm looking at the time. I'm going to the book. The book is called Monopsony Capitalism. The subtitle is The Twilight of the Sweatshop Age. There's actually no question mark in the book. But here I'm adding the question mark because, maybe it's not The Twilight of the Sweatshop Age. The book begins with me. I was, just trying to do field research in India. I was asked by this kind of organization that does investigations of factory struggles. I mean, most of those organizations are nonsense, and they're corporate front groups. But this one was quite good. It was started by unions in America. Anyways, they were like, oh, we need a translator. I went in, is like dusty little town called Ramnagara. Arvind is the third largest denim manufacturer in the world. They're an exclusive producer for Philip Van Heusen. Philip Van Heusen is the largest shirt manufacturer in the world. They own like Gant, Calvin Klein, Tommy Hilfiger. Anyways, the existing orthodoxy tells us that there's an asymmetrical relationship between buyers and suppliers. The buyers have the power, suppliers have no power. This is why the sweatshop, and we'll get to the dynamics of that in a second, this is basically why you've always had sweatshops in these sectors. But as I was sitting there doing these translations, it was clear that the dynamics were the inverse. There was that actually the Arvind VP had an enormous amount of power, and the Philip Van Heusen representative was just sort of like, seemed quite, wasn't pushing their weight at all. So as we laughed, I got a ride from the investigator on the way back, and I was like, well, that was nuts. That's not what I expected. And he said, I've been noticing this over and over again. And then I was like, okay, we need to look into this a little bit deeper. And so then I started doing kind of research on this, and then it basically lays the foundation for the book. People know about this. This is the Rana Plaza tragedy, April 24th, 2013. 1,134, mostly women workers, were crushed to death. Additional 2,500 were injured. All major brands were produced here. It's almost exactly 100 years after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire that killed 146 people in Manhattan. People know this. This isn't happenstance. This is part of the structural dynamics of capitalism. And there's been innumerable attempts in this sector to try and remedy these conditions. Multi-stakeholder agreements, codes of conduct, auditing regimes. There were multiple auditors that had signed off on Rana Plaza, official auditors. And none of them have succeeded, really. And it's because you can't have ethical production under mass production under capitalism. Because there's this law of motion, and it's called competition, and you cannot remain competitive if you're ethical. And so a rights-based framework, again, to quote Marx again, between two rights, four sides. The fact is that ultimately, what will change the dynamics of sweatshops is the combination of material conditions changing, composition of capitalism changing, and then the subjective agency of workers to organize within those conditions. So here I've got four pictures. You've got two, they're separated by 100 years. In the top, you have the garment sector. In the bottom, you have the auto sector. And so what you see is clearly, at the top you have women crouched over sewing machines. 100 years later, women crouched over sewing machines. At the bottom, it's become very automated. This is representative of why there's how the garment sector has remained, how sweatshops have remained durable in the garment sector. So, one of the key elements here is barriers to entry. Garment sector has very low barriers to entry. It's because let's imagine you're a capitalist in India or Cambodia, and you want to become an international capitalist. If you want to open up an auto factory, it'll cost you 100 million. If you want to open up an aeronautics plant, $1 billion. If you want to open up a garment factory, it might cost you $1 million. 3,000 workers, some primitive machines, and then you're for business. But the issue there becomes that effectively, that's what the structure means, that it's a monopsonistic structure. It means few buyers, many sellers. That's the definition of monopsony. People might know it in labor market monopsony. But essentially, I have a prop. It's like a bottleneck. You have many, many sellers and few buyers, and they're fighting like crazy to get the business of these buyers. And that gives lots of power to the buyers. It's a kind of, I always describe it as a kind of inverse of monopoly. Monopoly is a horizontal relationship. Monopsony is a vertical relationship. So, as the relationship between the buyers and the sellers changes, the degree of monopsony changes. So the more sellers you have and the fewer buyers you have a high degree of monopsony. The fewer sellers you have and the more buyers you have, or relatively, you have less monopsony. And that creates bottlenecks. And those bottlenecks are exploited by global brands and retailers. And you see the evolution of monopsony, it's always been monopsonistic, right? So if you look at, even at the turn of the 20th century, it was always, they called them jobbers back then, which were brands and retailers, and they could go to various different producers. But because of the limits on where capital go, that was a limit on monopsony. And that also meant that workers could organize effectively and resist, right? And we'll get to that in a second. Soon it became more, sort of regulated international production. So it's going to the maquilas in Mexico. It's going from the U.S. or in Europe. It's going to the more Mediterranean countries. And then as it's become more unregulated, it goes wherever, and that ends up having its own internal dynamics. And what it means is that you have cutting and running. The history of the garment sector and the footwear sector and toys and furniture is cutting and running. When workers organize, brands simply cut and run because they have no investment. It's a vertically disintegrated relationship. One of the key sort of ways to analyze this is the degree of monopsony is shaped by the product that's being produced, and that shapes the value chain structure and the bargaining power of workers. So here are some of the key dynamics of the garment sector. So the reason why it's remained this three-part structure is because it's seasonal, so it's constantly changing. It's tied to ephemeral fashion trends, constantly also changing. Low value at the point of production, so it's not producing value at the point of production. Precisely because of this three-part structure and the monopsonistic relationship, it's low technology, again, because if you have thousands of potential suppliers, they're competing against each other intensely, they're never able to accumulate enough value or capture enough value to escape the orbit of low margins and reinvest that into labor-saving technology. It's globalizable, it's constantly moving, it's a starter sector. It's the first to come and the first to go in the process of globalization. So it tells us, it's a kind of canary in the coal mine. It tells us where capitalism is going, where it's moving, how it's moving, et cetera. Again, we've talked about low barriers to entry. It's very easy to enter, relatively easy to enter the sector, which again intensifies competition and is exploited by global brands and retailers. And again, value capture happens quite a distance from the point of production. Ultimately, this leads to low bargaining power for suppliers and low bargaining power for workers. I'm going to drink some water. So the intervention or the theoretical framework here is this dynamic begins to change. The change happens, basically you have this multi-fiber agreement. So multi-fiber agreement was negotiated in the 1970s by kind of global north unions to put limits on where production could happen. It was a 30-year agreement, 1975 to 2005, which basically said that, it was a way to maintain production in the global north. Obviously, it didn't succeed. And what it meant was that you had production happening from the far-flung corners of the globe because they had limits on where it could be produced and where it could be sold. That ends in 2005. So first, as it's moving to different places, the monopsonistic relationship, meaning more where production can happen, increases, so the number of suppliers increases. As you have a higher monopsony, it means more value is being captured at the point of consumption or retail brands. 2005, the MFA, so it ends, so there's limitless. They can produce anywhere. As that happens, immediately capital goes wherever it's most profitable, and so the monopsonistic relationship is very sort of increases exponentially. So 2005 to 2008, you have some of the highest value being captured, highest profits until the crisis, precisely because they could produce anywhere. What that ends up doing is it ends up concentrating more and more production in Asia. This intensifies what Gary Jaffe calls buyer-driven dynamics. So buyer-driven means you have buyer-driven, which means that the buyers are the sort of shot callers in the supply chain, or producer-driven, where like aeronautics and automobiles, where the producer is the shot caller. So this means over time you have increased pressure, downward pressure, by the global brands and retailers. That downward pressure means that to buy a shirt or shoe or tie, they're asking for less and less. So over time, fewer and fewer suppliers are able to compete, which leads to consolidation. I mean, it's sort of like people are familiar with labor market monopsony. It's kind of like that. Like, imagine Alex. I don't know where he is. Imagine Alex is a capitalist. It's hard to imagine. Imagine he's a capitalist, and all of us this is the entire world, and he has a number of jobs, and we are competing because there's no welfare state, and we're competing intensely for that work. Over time, that means he has an incredible amount of power because we're desperate. The only way we can subsist is by selling our labor power, and Alex is gleefully profiting off of this. But then, over time, what it means is that, unfortunately, people can't subsist anymore, and fewer and fewer people are in the reserve army of labor, and that means over time, Alex's power, because of the marketplace bargaining power, falls. And that's what you see in the global supply chain. So over time, especially in the most valorizable parts of the sector, which is what I look at, meaning the ones that are able to actually mechanize and integrate, et cetera. Over time, fewer suppliers are able to compete, which leads to consolidation. That consolidation means falling degree of monopsony power, increased share of value to the producer, increased automation. I made a mess. Increased automation, vertical and horizontal integration, and this raises the barriers and weakens the buyer-driven chain towards a kind of buyer-supplier symbiosis. So what that means is over time in certain parts of the sector, of course it's not, over time you're that Cambodian or Indian capitalist, and now it might cost you $2 million, $2.5 million. That increased barrier to entry puts pressure on the competitive nature of monopsony, which then has the effect of limits on the value capture at the point of consumption. And this isn't just in this sector. I went to a talk, William Hunt from Sussex on the first day, and he was talking about how actually even in forms of like platform delivery services, you've seen in forms of concentration. This is part of the underlying logics of capitalism. It moves in this direction. So it's nothing particular to this sector. And what is the effect of this on workers' bargaining power? So here you have the idea of spatial inflexibility. So what spatial inflexibility means is How much space does capital have to undermine the disruptive power of workers? Like, what is this? So under the regime of regulatory spatial inflexibility up until the 1970s, they were or embedded liberalism, you had this degree of regulations on where capital can move, where capital is able to compete, and you had workers basically run after capital and was able to put pressure on them. And so this created greater bargaining power for workers. But of course, after the crisis of the 1970s and the beginning of what you call globalization, this begins to fall. What I'm arguing here is that what we're moving towards is a kind of market spatial inflexibility. As it moves more and more towards consolidation, economies of scale, increased barriers to entry, increased investment in fixed capital investment, this intensifies sunk costs and potentially changes the bargaining power of workers. Because it's fundamentally a question of why do sweatshops exist, and if those dynamics are changing, then it makes for interesting possibilities. But of course, this is just about the possibilities, the disruptive possibilities of workers. It's not a kind of teleological thing that this happens, obviously, automatically. But it just means that they have more potential structural bargaining power against their now value-laden, more central, and more increasingly powerful suppliers. So, as an example of the kind of regulatory spatial inflexibility, here's the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, based in the US. They had these jobbers agreements. So you had this three-part system where you had a jobber, which is a brand and retailer of today. You had the producer, which is like a factory. And then you had, obviously, workers. Workers couldn't just make demands on suppliers because it was the same dynamics of today. They make a demand on suppliers, increase costs for paying workers more, then the jobbers would cut and run. So what they did, and they were not succeeding for the first few decades of the 20th century. Then there was a jobber strategy. So they said, okay, we're going to put pressure on the producers. We're going to put pressure on the retailers. We're going to get agreements from both of them, and then we're going to force them to make agreements. So a three-part agreement. So what it did was, look at these lovely women here setting prices. They're sitting there, they're setting prices, and they get off from the garment floor, and they're setting prices. And then they negotiate that with the managers, and then they force the retailers to ring-fence those additional costs. And so this was part of the regulatory spatial inflexibility. It allowed the ILGW, I interviewed the sort of last organizing director of the ILGW, they would literally chase the work wherever it went, and they would force them to recognize the union, or they would shut it down. This, of course, begins to change as globalization sets in. Here's Hugh Yen. Hugh Yen is the largest shoe manufacturer in the world, exclusive producer for Nike and Adidas. Nike, as you guys call it. Nike and Adidas is the exclusive producer. They produce most of their shoes here, or almost all their shoes here, in one of the Hugh Yen facilities. The same dynamics existed in footwear. It wasn't tied down to the multi-fiber agreement. It was basically unregulated from the 90s. It steadily absorbed, you had hundreds, thousands of shoe manufacturers before this that Nike and other major brands manufactured from. But over time, they were able to absorb, for any number of reasons, market share. This is a Taiwanese company. So 1 in 5 shoes in this room will have been produced at a Hugh Yen facility. And so this was the largest strike of a private sector employer in Chinese history. 50,000 workers went on strike. Of course, a wildcat strike because it's not officially recognized by the state. But as they went on this wildcat strike over social insurance, of course, there was 27 million in direct losses from lost production for the company and 31 million in concessions that they were able to gain from them. The workers were, ultimately they didn't win their exact demands, but they were able to win some concessions. The most important thing, and I'm going back to the George Lucas quote, that it's moments of rupture or crisis that reveal the inner workings. Nike and Adidas never cut and run. They moved production to other places shortly, but then went back to Hugh Yen. And what that reveals is that Nike needs Hugh Yen almost as much as Hugh Yen, or Hugh Yen needs Nike almost as much as Nike needs Hugh Yen. It's like the dynamics are fundamentally changing. But it's a complicated story. You have a very sort of wealthy company like Hugh Yen. Unlike other companies, it means that they can withstand strike action for longer days. They can garrison, which they did, the factories. They can pay off provincial officials, because there was a kind of antagonism at the time between the Communist Party's central strategy of basically getting rid of kind of sweatshop production because it wasn't in their strategy, whereas provincial officials were a little bit different. There is a kind of antagonism there. And they were able to do all those things, yet we see an example of this really. I mean, once this strike happened, this happened in Guangzhou. A few days later, it was spread to Shenzhen. Thousands of workers went on strike. 6 months later, in Ho Chi Minh City, same Po Yuan, which is a subsidiary Hu Yen is a subsidiary of Po Yuan, but another subsidiary in Vietnam, they went on strike, largest strike of a private sector employer in Vietnamese history. They won all their demands. It's also on social insurance, so they made similar demands and they won. But it's not always a great story, unfortunately. This is Arvind, third largest denim manufacturer in the world. Again, shoes, denim. I'll get to men's undergarments in a second, but basically, those are the most valorizable. Why? Because they're the least seasonal and they're the least tied to sort of fashion trends. And so what that means is that you can standardize it. If you can standardize it, you can automate it. So here, Arvind Mills, third largest. Then it was historically vertically integrated until the 90s, which is, again, speaks to the fact that it was most valorizable. It's highly specialized, more capital intensive. This is denim. While the basic material, namely cotton, remains unchanged. So it allows for more capacity in technological and economic upgrading. So this worker struggle was for unionization in Ramnagara near Bangalore. And it was between 2011 and 2015. And precisely because Arvind was so powerful, they were able to, and this was a warehouse which was a crucial node in the production process, but it was a pressing warehouse, which means you go out and you're producing stuff and it's going out to the market across the Middle East, across Southeast Asia, Southern Europe. But what the company did, because it was a violent response. They had all these strongmen, and it was all mostly 95% women, but they would sexually harass the women, but then it was a village, so they would attack the men, their husbands, brothers, etc. But then what they did, obviously that costs money. They also got expensive interstate workers, which they housed in dormitories, who didn't speak Kannada, which is a language spoken from the Northeast, typically. So that was a mechanism to undermine the union struggle. They also moved it from a pressing warehouse, which is a core function, to a returns warehouse. So you go to a place, you return, it goes to another warehouse. So that's a peripheral function. And they were able to do all of this and withstand the strike precisely because of their resources. So sometimes resources, of course, can be not just leverage for power, but used to undermine workers. And then lastly, I look at fruit of the loom. This is men's undergarments. Again, very standardized. It's come straight as a commodity producer. This is one of the big three. Fruit of the loom, Hanes, Gildan. And this is the largest private sector employer in Honduras. Their entire supply chain is there. They have 9 factories, last time I checked. They might have more now, but basically, there was a number of women went, and at Jersey Day, Honduras in 2008, 2009, they organized a union. The factory was shut down. Again, it was vertically integrated, so it's a little bit different than the other places. It shut down. You had an international campaign, boycotts, 132 universities in the U.S. primarily, cut contracts. It cost the company $50 million within the first 6 months. But that was a secondary pressure, right? It was precisely because workers were organizing so effectively, but it was also because it was vertically integrated. It was a cotton producer. They basically owned the fields. That cotton was very standardized. There was a lot of investment in technology, and they were able to win. I mean, there's no ethical production, but this is not me saying buy fruit of the loom, but I'm saying the reason why they won through struggle and they would make 40% more than any worker who produces anything else in the region. They also have lots of other benefits, recognition across the entire supply chain for the union. They have collective bargaining, and so this is a victory precisely because they were able to leverage the existing integration to their benefit, and it wasn't they were unable to cut and run effectively. But this process, this dynamic, I want to just use this as an example. Outsourced cleaners as just one example, but I think that this dynamic is not particular. I'm using garments as a kind of case because it's so globalizable. It allows us to analyze it clearly and the dynamics within capitalism. But even if you look at, for example, outsourced cleaners, over time you had thousands of companies in the 90s and the 2000s. Over time, it's become more consolidated, especially after COVID, because you had falling inward migration from the EU, which were a lot of cleaners. And so then meant weaker producers, weaker companies were going out of business, bigger ones were gobbling up their market share. And over time, you've also seen us kind of insourcing, and you've seen these campaigns. I can say from our own negotiations at Birkbeck, one of the ways that it became insourced, and a number of universities have become insourced, was that we said, look, there's this threat of UV. I mean, we didn't say this, but they felt the threat of these kind of more syndicalist unions, so they insourced it. It's a combination then of both the changing liabilities of this consolidation, but also agitation. And so what about skill? So the question of skill comes up, and I'm always curious, especially because people, I'm not a sociologist, but this is part of the debates I hear. I find it difficult to understand the role of skill, because it's like, I think that producing a garment from a primitive machine is very skillful, but it's seen as unskilled precisely because they don't have disruptive power. It's a representation of disruptive power. I mean, if you look at the ILGW, I had a photo from Life magazine there. That was from 1948. In 1948, garment workers were considered skilled. Why? Because they'd made gains and they were making the same amount of money as an auto worker. It's never been done before and never done afterwards. So skill is a representation of the ability to make gains. So here you have an auto factory that's seen as more skilled, or an aeronautics plant, it's seen as even more skilled. But I think this is, I think we should problematize this a little bit. Also at the university. So I think, we were having discussions last night about this. I think it's kind of important to try and analyze what our role is in society and how we can leverage that. It is the case that, this was the university as a factory was said in that sort of pejorative in the 1960s, but I think we should analyze it as a kind of factory. And we should sort of like lean into that. Universities, the role now is primarily to kind of reproduce labor power by, again, anchoring the idea of skill. It adds a sort of leverage, a layer of labor market legitimacy. You say some CEO with a kind of Mickey Mouse MBA program degree is able to make 30, 40, 50 times more. It's just adding another layer of legitimacy to an unequal system. And so that's where our power lies, ultimately. And I think that, unfortunately, obviously the market boycott failed, but I think that is actually the only place. That is the critical choke point. The university isn't producing learning, really. It's producing a degree. That's the commodity. And the choke point in that commodity is the production of the degree. So if we want to leverage that, we have to understand where we sit within this, and also the concentration of resources. An analysis has to think, okay, what's the most profitable departments in our university? How are we organizing them most effectively? We were having, again, these discussions last night quite intensely, and I think we all agreed, we have to, as a union or as workers, we have to analyze this as where is the concentration of power and how do we leverage it? And one of the key cases, for example, in NYU graduate student strike 2021, they went on indefinite strike, and it's precisely because NYU was over-leveraged. They weren't like other institutions. They couldn't afford to really, lose weeks and weeks of potential pay from, fees from students. Or that was just, because of their over-leveraging, that was leveraged, and they were able to win a number of health and wage, they expanded healthcare and higher wages. So this is just bringing it back home a little bit. And so to end, 5 minutes. Okay, basically, I want to say that I think we need to just ground our analysis a little bit more, at least in resistance, on the sort of changing logics of capitalism, that the same underlying logics that led to globalization and what we call the spatial fix, the crisis that led to that, the sort of laws of motion, competition. I'm using Brenner again, but it's that competition that led to the kind of that crisis of the 1970s, which then led to globalization. That same law of motion is leading to forms of consolidation. That consolidation can be leveraged in effective ways in forms of resistance. I think ultimately this analysis needs to understand that the workplace is an antagonism between capital and labor, and that any change, at least in these labor-intensive sectors, I can say, any change, any gains will only be made through an analysis of the changing materiality of capital and the organized working class. Thank you very much.
Okay, so questions for Ashok, please. And I'll hand over the microphone.
Thank you very much. Zinovius Tsoupios, University of Leeds. Thank you for your presentation, excellent talk. A specific kind of question, rather, if you can comment on your in relation to the Indian case, and when you speak about the changing monopsony relation between the producers and buyers. What interests me is the role of the growth of Indian capitalism to this story. So if, let's say, in the previous decades, the buyers, the sellers, the producers, very much depend on the Western-based brands and the companies, and it created Swiss shopping, and etc. So when I was reading your article, I had a sense that the company, the case study I studied, they also operated very strongly, was strongly embedded in the Indian market. So to what extent the growth of the power of the Indian consumer, so the products can be sold in Indian market, not exported to the advanced capitalist economies in the West, allows the producers to gain more power in the sense. So what is the role of Indian capitalism in that sense? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. Yeah, so basically, if you look at, for example, because the distance between the space of value capture and the value, I'd say value is being produced across the supply chain, but value is being captured really at the top, historically. The way in which people would put pressure on those suppliers, on those brands, was that you'd have these kind of campaigns. Like I gave you the example of Fruit of the Loom. Because that's where the power was. They were like, okay, we can put pressure on these companies, and that's a form of solidarity. It still is possible, of course, because it's still an asymmetrical relationship. But you have the growth of these producers in the global south. So you have, for example, Arvind. They have a number of brands that they sell and they produce and sell across the global south, but particularly in India, and you have this kind of burgeoning consumer market in the south. Those, there is an internal competition question because Huyen, for example, doesn't produce their own brands precisely because there is a kind of explicit or implicit understanding that that would undermine their production for Western brands. And that would undermine the potential. I mean, Western brands aren't stupid. I mean, of course, they're going to say, okay, this is undermining it, and we're funneling this company potentially to undermine it. I mean, this is why, in some instances, because of the liability that's involved with that, you had Adidas, Nike. I mean, they've now dropped the plans since COVID, but before that, to open fully, not fully, but very automated factories in Germany, France, and England. Those plans have fallen through. It also means that, like, you have forms of South-South pressure. So even with when Huyen was on strike, you had strikes and you had protests in Turkey, in India, in Cambodia. You had a number of, because those products were now also being sort of mass sold in these countries. So there's a kind of, it's representative of a kind of changing dynamic. But if you look at Arvind, for example, they were one of thousands of like cotton firms that began in the 1920s and 30s when you had this kind of campaign to produce only in India and sell in India. And they really pick up in the 1980s because they transfer the labor process to women to kind of stitch. It was a kind of campaign to be like, okay, there was a lot of suspicion in India around whether you can buy ready-made garments because they're like, oh, that's low quality. And so they would have pieces of denim, some thread, and you could sort of stitch the last end of it. So they were transferring the labor process. They come up with this idea, and it's very popular. And so that's a kind of part of the denim revolution, and they were able to edge out other people. But historically, you're right. There was this clear, they had a kind of comprador relationship in which they were able to get some capital, and the Indian state said, okay, you can't sell in India unless you have a proportion that's being done with a kind of, with a company that's an Indian-based company. But that's changing a little bit, but not dramatically, I think.
More questions or observations?
Hello, I'm Shobha Arun, University of Essex. Thank you, Ashok, for that very exhaustive overview. My question specifically on your positional power, and I was wondering what your thoughts were in relation to the recent legislations, for example, the Alliance, the Accord in Bangladesh, the Modern Slavery Act, and these kind of global response and pressures. And has it helped to weaken or strengthen worker resistance? Your thoughts on this?
Well, I guess I could talk a little bit about the Accord. For people who aren't familiar, the Accord came about after Rana Plaza. It was a coalition of groups, some brands. Industrial was driving it, which is a kind of global union. The old ITG merged into a number of different unions. And anyways, it was driven by that. And it's quite a top-down approach to try to get some building standards. There weren't many local unions that were involved in it. The problem is, if you look at some place, and Mark Anner's done really great work on not specifically on the Accord, but the dynamics specifically in Bangladesh, as opposed to other places. A problem is when 78% of your trade is related to the garment sector, which is low margins, you're a one-trick pony, and that's the problem in Bangladesh. If you set standards, this is the internal dynamic. This is the problem. If they increase the cost nominally in Bangladesh, then the state is acutely aware of this, that then companies will stop producing in Bangladesh because the risk-to-reward ratio just doesn't work out. And you have strikes in Bangladesh all the time. You have militant unions in Bangladesh. They're like burning down factories. It still doesn't change the fact that there is this intense market pressure and the state is compliant. You have laws in Bangladesh that are obviously not enforced because they're so dependent on the sector. The problem with the Accord is that I think there's specific problems with the Accord, but I think that they're operating. I mean, it's collapsed basically, but it's it's not enforced, and there's no one even doing anything on the Accord. But it was they're working within the confines of a system that rewards countries that obviously have the weakest standards, typically. And the ones that are produced in Bangladesh are the least valorizable, right? It's like kind of like women's blouses and stuff like that. They're constantly changing, so it can't be standardized.
More points, questions?
Hi there, thanks a lot for that. It was really interesting. Obviously one of the issues is that you've just raised around, militant unions in Bangladesh, there are militant unions in other countries. To what extent are we seeing in any industries those unions globalizing and making relationships, which are obviously the sort of the necessary next step? And in some industries it's obviously easier, so there's a history of seafaring unions being much more global and other things, but these are the ones where this is going to be necessary to stop that movement.
Yeah, I think that there have been campaigns. Thanks for the question. So there was a campaign that was trying to organize Adidas workers everywhere, and they were specifically choosing that. And it was people who were involved in the ILGW before. And the person I was speaking about, who was the last organizing director of the ILGW, their whole strategy was, you go to backbone shops. So there are peripheral and core functions, and backbone shops are the shops like Huyen, or shops that if they were organized, there's no way that companies could cut and run. And so there was an attempt, it's still ongoing a little bit, to organize specifically places that were more anchored, and that campaign is ongoing. You have Sikadu in Cambodia, you have Taksif in Turkey, and like Gatu in India, and a few unions, also the unions that were involved in the Fruit of the Loom campaign in Honduras. Those unions are working together to try and sort of organize these backbone shops, but it's still early. I think the big unions, unfortunately, if you look at like the old ITG, 90% of their unions are paper unions. They're basically nonprofits that don't really have a membership base, unfortunately. There are some good unions like NGWF and Taksif, and these are associated, and Sikadu that are associated with Industrial, but by and large, 90% are paper unions. So the official organizations that are supposed to organize workers across the world are kind of, they're not very strong.
Hi, I'm at Bride University, Manchester, so thanks very much for a very engaging talk. I just wondered, you started off talking about a crisis, and there's obviously a huge crisis we're facing with regard to climate crisis. Some of the countries you're talking about may not be able to have factories there in, 10, 30 years' time. people might have to relocate factories, actually. I'm just wondering if you sort of thought of different scenarios about what will happen, you know, within that climate crisis, where there may be whole swathes of people having to relocate, etc.
That's a heavy question. Yeah, I mean, I haven't really thought about, not, obviously I think about the climate crisis every day. It's on my mind all the time. But it's the places where you have the most concentration of production, which was historically the Pearl River Delta region, but now it's moved to Vietnam, out of China, India, Bangladesh. They're all hotspots of the crisis. I mean, one of the new places where production's happening is in Ethiopia, and I think basically Africa will be the new terrain where garment production is happening, because they have enough capacity that's built up in Vietnam. I just I haven't really thought about how it relates to the garment sector. I think that, yeah, I haven't thought about it as much, but it's something to think about.
There must be a point from this side of the room. Come on, someone. Yeah, please.
I'm not going to stand, by the way. I was just wondering.
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh yeah, I'm Emily. I was wondering, like, us as consumers, how do we? It always seems difficult. Like sometimes they say it's ethical, and then it's not ethical. Like, we're kind of, how do we use our buying power to support?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Look, I think that secondary boycotts have been historically a very effective strategy, but as a secondary pressure point. So if you look at, for example, the Grape Boycott, United Farm Workers. I mean, my parents still don't buy grapes, even though that's not existed for like 50 years. It was a highly effective strategy to put pressure. Also, if you look at, for example, Fruit of the Loom was an example of this. Again, secondary pressure. I remember after Rana Plaza collapsed, there were very well-intentioned British people on Oxford Street standing in front of Primark being like, don't buy Primark. It's like, from Primark to Prada, it was all produced there. But it's like, I mean, to blame the British working class or for you know, it's not measured in any way of like cheap clothing versus, it's all produced there. Other than maybe like haute couture, which is produced often domestically. But it's a question of seeing the sort of agents here as, and just in terms of efficacy, as workers organizing and then us putting pressure on capital. I think that the consumer stuff in the global north, because of this kind of changing dynamic, does mean that it means you have less power. You had 30 years where that was the strategy. You had workers organizing, you'd had lots of pressure. Sometimes companies would agree. So for example, there were cases in Mexico, there was a case called Just Garments in El Salvador, where they were able to keep it open. And this is a worker-run factory in El Salvador. They were able to keep it open for long enough, but as soon as the pressure after a few years fell, they would slowly cut and run. And there was no way to put pressure on them to say, no, you have to buy from this place. And there were attempts made. There was this thing called the Designated Suppliers Program, which was like attempting to force these companies to buy from only a designated number of suppliers that had democratic unions. But it's, I think, again, there's a difference between sort of hot shop organizing. Anyone who's been a trade union organizer knows this difference. Hot shop organizing and strategic organizing. Hot shop organizing is where some workers go on strike, and you go, or something happens. The boss does something terrible, fires someone, closes down a factory, whatever. And you organize that place, and that's a hot shop. You're responding, and it's an effective way to mobilize people. But then there's strategic organizing, which is like what GATU is trying to do now. They've been doing hot shop organizing for decades. And now they're like, okay, where is it? So for example, like, you know, the production of the little tags behind you, that's part of the garment sector. It's highly automated. Those companies produce, a big one produces in Bangalore. They're now strategically organizing that place because they're like, okay, this is where we can leverage the most power. And that's a mechanism. It's not to say you don't also do hot shop organizing, but it's like understanding the production process to sort of leverage and mobilize in the most efficacious way.
Time for one more question.
Hi, yeah, Alex Wood from Bristol University. Yeah, really fascinating talk, and I think it's really interesting, this dynamic that you've kind of uncovered. And as you've elevated me to the capitalist class, I was wondering about the kind of the future of kind of my profits. Because I think what's interesting in like Beverly Silver is that she then, it's a dynamic that kind of repeats throughout history of kind of these long waves and business cycles. And do you see it in the same way that you get this concentration and then kind of the potential for profits increases again, and then new kind of players start entering the market again, and then you'll get this kind of this fragmentation again and lowering of profits, or is it the end of kind of?
Well, look, I think the reason, great question, thanks, Alex. It's that when you say Twilight of the Sweatshop Age, people are like, what? This is so triumphant. It's like, look, if we look at, most people won't say an auto factory is a sweatshop. Typically, they're not sweatshops, right? A current auto factory. The reason why, as garment factories become more automated, let's say, and become integrated, it's very hard to move from a direction of travel of monopsony to like more monopsony. It's not like you then become, you lower I mean, of course, technologies become cheaper, et cetera, but over time, it's moving in this direction. And you can see that it's moving in that direction in certain sectors. It might not move more generally, but it's moving in certain parts of the sector, and those become like kind of, they indicate other things of the other parts of the sector. So you're saying, okay, it's moving in this automated direction. That means that all of these dynamics that are integral to making to the durability of the sweatshop, obviously you're like, okay, why does the sweatshop exist? Okay, now these things are withering away. So what we understand to be the sweatshop, I mean, the sweatshop is an evocative thing. It's not to suggest, like, we could say any place that workers don't control things is a sweatshop. But I'm saying, in the kind of traditional sense of the term, we're moving more and more away from that. And that means potentially increased disruptive power because they can't replace that factory as easily, right? But then you look at something like Boohoo that happened during COVID. I don't know if people remember this in Leicester, where women there were making, and it was like little shops where people were producing, they were making like, if you were making £4 an hour there, you were like at the upper end. And you're like, how is that even possible that this exists? But it's precisely, it came about during a time of crisis. Well, it existed prior to that, but it really took off at a time of crisis where they were able to reduce lead times. And so I think that's an exception. I actually don't think that's the rule, that we're gonna move towards this kind of situation where you have smaller and smaller shops. I think we do move towards something where you have more integration. I mean, I think of like Brett Christopher's work for Great Levelers, where it's like, okay, it moves from high competition to high monopoly, and it's not that it's just, the state isn't interested in the state, but it isn't interested in more and more monopolization because it sort of undermines in some ways the durability of the system. And the state isn't interested in a single capital. They're interested in maintaining capitalism as a system. The problem here is there's no kind of global state in the same kind of way. So I don't know how they'll control for that. But again, I think it's a complicated story. They can then, more concentrations of wealth can be used obviously to undermine workers' bargaining power, but to use Kalecki, it means potentially greater distribution because you can make greater demands because now they're more value laden. So yeah, I mean, it might be, I'm just saying, look, here's how it's changing. There are mechanisms that we can now leverage this, and we should take advantage of that.
Okay, let's give it up for Ashok.